I thought it would be fun to do like a common booktube controversy, conversation, drama kind of tier list. So I took all the topics like that in the bookish sphere, dropped it into one of these tier ranking lists, and I thought we'd just go through them today and see where they rank. My tier rankings are gonna be can't get enough. I love this conversation, love the tea, love the drama. Always something I'm happy to see be relevant. Learning something new. That's a conversation where maybe I was excited, maybe I wasn't, but I do feel like I'm always learning something and my opinion is evolving and changing the more this topic's brought up. I'll hear you out. I am slightly positive, but not really loving everything that's going on there, or maybe getting just a little bit tired of this kind of conversation. Fine is kind of my middle tier. I accept that we're having this conversation. I accept that people want to talk about it, but I feel like I'm past that at this point. Pass is gonna be just where I don't really care that much for it. And then of course at the bottom is never talk about this again. And that's just where I think this conversation or drama or take is too stupid to exist even here on the internet. And starting off strong, we're gonna go with listening to audiobooks isn't reading. This is an argument back and forth about whether or not listening to audiobooks counts as reading or not. And the answer is obviously yes, it does, which is why this is going right away as an easy, let's never talk about this again tier. Next is gonna be reading speed. How much is too much? For me, this is just a standard pass. I do think there's some interesting conversations going on about people's different abilities and levels when it comes to reading, or if you have like some kind of learning disability that might make this difficult for you. I think also there's an interesting point to be made about reading academic rigorous work or reading and annotating something versus just like speeding through pleasure reading. But like as an overall thing, I just find myself generally disinterested in this conversation and where it usually takes us. Next is going to be ebook piracy. And this is another one where personally I just pass. If you're here in the US, I don't think you should be pirating ebooks, generally speaking. If you're living someplace where you're pirating the ebook because you can't get your hands on a copy of the book the normal way, I am more understanding. It's one of those issues where like capitalism sucks, right? Because authors need to make money, but if something isn't distributed in the right way, or if you just don't have the socioeconomic backing, it's like, what do you do? All of it just sucks all around. I don't really want to have the conversation in general. Getting a book from the library isn't supporting the author. I think this is a never talk about it again. This is such a stupid take. Obviously, having your book in the library helps an author become more known, get to meet new and different audiences, and also like libraries buy books, you know? Book hauls promote overconsumption. As far as like a topic, I think I'm gonna rank this up at fine. You know, I think there are plenty of people who book haul responsibly, and that's great. I do think that showing book hauls off have an overall negative impact on an audience. Like it encourages an audience and creates like this subconscious drive to like purchase things or fear of missing out. Generally, I view book hauls negatively, and personally I don't watch them. But I mean, if that's content that you love watching or content you love making, like meh, who am I to shame you? As long as you make purchases responsibly and you don't encourage anyone else to purchase irresponsibly, it's really not my business. Next is reading is an academic hobby. When people think that reading is a smarter hobby or it takes more effort, makes you better than people who play video games or do movies or I don't know, do any of a million other hobbies, they're wrong, and I think it's a stupid point to make. Generally speaking, I think I'd pass on this. It's like a conversation I understand why we need to have once in a while, and we need to talk about why reading would make you smart, because like good reading comprehension can be a form of intelligence, and getting people invested and interested in literacy can definitely help people in their life going forward. But like me reading like paranormal fantasy and science fiction and romance books, I don't think is any healthier or better or superior than like other hobbies really. Another's gonna be booktubers who lie about books they read, and this is like a never talk about it again situation for me. I just think like gathering a body of evidence, trying to prove or disprove, making accusations is also so tiring and boring, and like really You either enjoy watching the person or you don't. I don't necessarily think it matters whether or not they read the book. That's probably a hot take. Obviously, I prefer honesty, but I don't think it matters. And I also don't think that as viewers, we can really like parse all of that out necessarily, and it's not really worth our time or effort. Reading diversely is over or under emphasized. Fine. I get tired of hearing about reading diversely and whether or not it's important and how important it is. Mostly I'm fine with this conversation continually popping up because it sparks more people to think about reading diversely or to think about their reading habits, because it's very easy just to continually consume what's being recommended to you. And a lot of times your recommendations are going to put you towards like a certain kind of genre or a certain kind of author or a certain kind of story, and it's gonna mean that you're not out there and seeking and finding new and different things and stuff that you might like even better than what you're reading right now. Should white authors be writing Black stories? And I sort of oversimplified this particular drama. It's really more about like, should an author that doesn't have a certain kind of minority background be writing a story specifically from that minority perspective? So notably, this isn't the same as should white authors be writing Black characters or characters of color. Obviously, if we want diversity in storytelling, then we're gonna want all authors to write diverse casts, right? This particular like argument is more about whether or not someone who's not of that group can write a story that's like coming from that group. So to differentiate for you guys, in like the Animorphs, for example, Marco is a Hispanic person and Cassie is a Black child, and they're all together in this group like fighting aliens, and their race and ethnicity don't really come into it. There's not like all this cultural stuff. It's not part of their character arc or story that's pushing things forward. So they're just an example of including a diverse group within your story, not so much of writing a Black story or a Hispanic story. But Sylvia Moreno Garcia, for example, writes stories that are centered in Mexico and are often telling stories that are specifically about a Mexican person's experience. And on the flip side of that, instead of having someone like Sylvia Moreno Garcia who gives like this authentic flavor and is part of that group and is expressing like actual honest experiences they're having, you've got books like American Dirt, where you've got a white author who's telling about a Mexican's immigration story to America, and it was heavily criticized, not because she was writing a Mexican character, but she was writing a story like from a Mexican person's perspective that many people felt was inauthentic and inaccurately told. And as you can probably tell by how long it's taken me just to unpack all of this stuff, I really can't get enough. I have had a whole bunch of different perspectives and thoughts on the spectrum about this topic over time, and it's through listening to other people talk about this and consuming more on the topic that I've continually grown and changed my opinion, and hope to continue to grow and have new and differing opinions here. Next is going to be authors responding to a review. This is going to go actually in the I'll hear you out category. I think it's something that we have to keep talking about because I don't think that authors should respond to reviewers. There is one conversational story I've heard about Sylvia Moreno Garcia responding to someone's critique about a fact element in one of her stories. And in that case, she didn't respond to the reviewer specifically. She just pointed out that the information about how to handle a seizure, one of the characters tries to do something based off of misinformation, and on the same page is corrected like, no, that's incorrect and doesn't work. And the reviewer had specifically been calling them out because they thought that they were perpetuating bad information about how to handle a seizure. And that just wasn't true. Like, one and the only one example I know of where a author responding to criticism from reviewers is sort of appropriate and might even have been necessary. I think authors shouldn't respond to reviewers, and the reason that we need to put it in the I'll hear you out category is because social media has sort of like forced reviewers and authors to be together, and it's kind of forced authors to be like their own publicists, which means that they're stumbling across reviews and different ways to like kind of get their name mentioned and talked about more often than they were before. And as a result of all of this, we need to keep having this conversation and reminding authors like,
hey, I know there's a lot of pressure on you. I know that you're doing a lot, and because of that, you're stumbling into these areas that really aren't meant for you. And I just want to remind you, this is a reviewer space, or this is a review, and you should not give feedback on a review. Maybe you shouldn't even be here watching it right now or reading it.
So as tiring as it is that we have to keep having that conversation, I do think it's necessary to keep pushing it. Next is going to be genre X is not for serious readers. Usually this is something that is specific towards romance readers, but I've heard people say it about fantasy or science fiction or horror. And I'm sure they say it about like other maybe mystery thriller. Basically that literature is not serious and readers aren't like real readers or aren't serious. It kind of stems back from like the reading it as an academic trait or an academic hobby. And this is one that I think we could also never talk about again. Everyone who reads is a real reader regardless of what it is. Next is going to be you're not a fan of genre Y if you haven't read blank. I can't tell you how many times people have tried to like gatekeep fantasy or science fiction, specifically with books like Dune or The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings. And I just think that people get too hung up on classics. And I think another serious issue with like, if you haven't read this, you're not a real fan, is that it forgets a lot of these classics that people are always pushing and popularizing are by like old white men. We don't want to fall into a trap where we think this genre is only for one group of people or only an expression for one group of people. And by not including classics from like a diverse background, I just feel like we're continuing to push that note or genre forward. So this is another one I just feel like we could literally never talk about it again. No one could ever bring that up and we'd all be better. Next is going to be book bans. This is one where I learned something new. I honestly wish we never had to talk about book bans again, but not talking about it I don't think would make it go away. So it's something that for me I feel like it's very important to keep up to date. Changing a review because the author is problematic. I'm one of those people who believes that your review should reflect your thoughts and opinions on the book, not on the author or the creator of whatever that media is. I don't really like review bombing a property unless you've seen the property and don't like it for some reason, or read the property and don't like it. However, I'm gonna tentatively put this up in I'll Hear You Out. I don't think you should do it, but I like to know why you're doing it. Next is gonna be author scandals. I'm gonna go ahead and put this in Learning Something New. I wish we didn't have author scandals. I wish it wasn't a thing, and I wish it didn't matter. Unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. So with that, I like to at least hear what it is and decide for myself how I feel about it. Next is going to be readers must review arcs. I think this is silly. So as an author who has often tried very hard to get people to review my book, I understand the desperation that authors feel. And you would think that like giving an arc out might guarantee you these reviews. However, you cannot make someone do that, and you certainly can't make someone do that when you're not paying them anything. Reading a book, especially in the fantasy and science fiction genre over here, can take a long time. Like 75,000 words is a small book. Easy a day, day and a half of reading. And then if you're actually making notes and highlights to make like a more thoughtful or in-depth review, it just takes a lot of time and effort. If you're not being compensated at all, this as a drama is generally a pass. Like, it doesn't quite make the never talk about this again. I do think it's important to highlight that authors really are heavily dependent on reviewers, but the way this is framed, it's a little bit entitled to think that a free book even begins to cover it. All booktubers read the same books. This one is an I'll Hear You Out. I do think you see a lot of the same book over and over again. Part of that is like a result of the algorithm, and part of it is just like if something is taking off, everyone wants to jump on that bandwagon because the reason that you're filming or scripting or doing any of this stuff is because you'd like to have some views so people would comment and give you conversation and stuff. There's a lot of lesser known things I want to bring attention to, but I can't do that unless I have the attention. That said, like, even though I have picked out books or like favored reading books specifically because they're popular on Booktube, I've never gone and read something I had zero interest in specifically because it was popping off. Like, I'm just not gonna read Colleen Hoover. Nothing about her appeals to me, and it doesn't matter that my Barnes & Noble has a huge Colleen Hoover display and that she's all over my Booktube feed and all of that stuff. I just don't see the appeal. Next is gonna be influencers promoting problematic books or authors. For me, this is like a fine. conversation. My feelings on this kind of like shift back and forth all the time, and there's a couple reasons for that. Number one is you don't know what you don't know. So it's sort of like shoulder shruggy whether or not someone is aware of something. Also, the term problematic is way too broad for me, and someone can do something problematic and still be perfectly readable to me. And then another thing is there are some books or some authors that you might read specifically because they are problematic and then be doing a review explaining why those things are an issue, why you don't like them, or how this promotes this certain thing or this other thing. Sometimes that gets lumped in with like platforming the problematic thing itself, but like you can't explain to people who don't know without reading it and going through it. So it's sort of like a catch-22. I don't want to say do whatever you want to do because there's definitely some stuff I don't think is okay. It's just one of those like quagsires I don't want to get dragged into. Next is going to be a reviewer should never one-star a review. This is like a fine topic. I think it's a little stupid because obviously I think you should be able to one-star something, and I do one-star books. But I do think like discussing who one-stars books, why you one-star them, all that kind of stuff is good. And if the way that we get to that conversation is starting with someone doing a hot take that you shouldn't negatively review books, then at least we get something good out of it. Next is going to be what I'm calling the DNF wars. Is it okay not to finish a book? Do you owe an author a certain amount of attention or time to like build their case before you put down the book? Do you have to 100% finish the book? I hear arguments back and forth about DNFing or not DNFing all the time, and people are very entrenched. I like to hear people out on it. I have my own opinion on it. It's not going to change, but I do think this one specifically is kind of fun and silly. I kind of like to hear where a person is coming from and learn more about them and their reading habits. Reviewers shouldn't rate a DNF. Now this one is more controversial to me, and there are a whole lot of takes. Like some people think it depends how far in you got. Like if you're 70% in and you decide you're disgusted and put a book down, should you be able to rate that book because you almost finished it? Or like is 50% enough? Is 25% enough? Is one sentence enough? I do think it's an interesting conversation. Mostly I do rate and review books I don't finish, but there have been some that I didn't finish and left unrated. Past conversation, mostly because I know exactly where I stand on it, and I think if there was something in the book that made you put it down, then you definitely should rate and review it. But the way specifically this conversation is structured, reviewers shouldn't ever rate something because you haven't finished it, so you're not qualified. That just rubs me the wrong way, and I pass on that kind of convo. Next is going to be the adaptation trials, and I love this conversation. I can't get enough. I'm still trying to figure out what makes a good adaptation because I don't think strict adherence to the source material is always the best way to go. But I love looking at everyone else's take on that. And I love it if you've got a hot take and you're the odd one out, whether it's because you love something that everyone else hated or you hated something everyone else loved. And I also think it's really interesting if you like a movie or a TV show but you think it's a bad adaptation. That's also like an awesome conversation to me. So everything adaptation related is always a good time to me. And then last but not least, are trigger warnings or content warnings spoilers? And if so, should they for some reason be hidden in reviews and ratings? This one comes up back and forth all the time. I'm gonna go ahead and bring it up to I'll hear you out. I don't love the conversation that goes on, and I think that sometimes one side or the other gets like way too heated and angry, but I do learn new things when we have these conversations, both about how people read, how they view spoilers, about both content and trigger warnings, and about like book production, how things get rated. I've learned a ton from this conversation. I don't love the framing of it because a lot of times the implication is that if a content warning or a trigger warning is a spoiler, then you should not provide it. And I do think like other people's comfort is more important than like keeping the surprise. And I'm a little bit biased because I like spoilers. In fact, I don't think spoilers negatively impact a read. I think in some cases they actually make the read better. And that's going to be my first attempt making any kind of reading tier list and a couple quick thoughts I had on these reoccurring dramas you see on Booktube. And I'd love it if you guys would go ahead and talk to me in those comments down below. What is your most often seen Booktube conversation, controversy, or drama? And tell me what you think about it. And keep reading. Bye!